My name is Ananya Patel, and I'm writing this from my apartment in Chicago where I live alone, surrounded by a confusing mix of American and Indian cultural objects that don't quite cohere into a unified identity, still trying to process the devastating realization that hit me during my first trip to India at age 22 when my cousins in Gujarat called me ABCD, American Born Confused Desi, mocked my American accent when I spoke Gujarati, criticized my Western clothes as inappropriate, and made clear that I would never be accepted as truly Indian despite my brown skin, Hindu name, and parents who immigrated from the same village where my relatives still lived. At 27, I've spent 5 years grappling with the grief of permanent outsider status, too American to belong in India, too Indian to be fully accepted in America, fitting nowhere completely, and carrying the psychological burden of being caught between two worlds that both claim me and reject me simultaneously, leaving me in a cultural no man's land where authentic belonging feels impossible. The identity confusion began in childhood when I was growing up in suburban Illinois as the daughter of Indian immigrants who maintained strong connections to their homeland through language, food, religious practices, and constant reminders that we were Indian, not American, despite the fact that I was born in Evanston Hospital and had never set foot in India. At home, we spoke Gujarati, ate traditional vegetarian meals, celebrated Hindu festivals, and followed cultural norms that marked us as distinctly different from my white classmates whose families represented the American normal I could never quite achieve. The American outsider experience was constant throughout my childhood and adolescence as white peers and teachers treated me as perpetually foreign despite my American birth and accent-free English. The eternal question, "Where are you really from?" positioned me as not quite American no matter how many times I explained that I was born in Illinois and had lived there my entire life. When I said I was American, people looked confused or disappointed, as if my brown skin required a more exotic origin story that would explain my physical difference from white Americans who were never questioned about their belonging. The cultural code switching became my daily survival strategy as I learned to be American Ananya at school, speaking English, eating cafeteria food, participating in mainstream activities, and minimizing visible markers of my Indian heritage, and Indian Ananya at home, speaking Gujarati with my parents, eating traditional food, observing Hindu practices, and embodying the cultural values and behaviors my parents expected. The constant shifting between these two identities was exhausting and created a fundamental question about which version was the real me, or whether either version was authentic at all. The India romanticization developed through my parents' stories about their homeland, which they described with nostalgia and longing as a place of authentic culture, strong family connections, and spiritual richness that America lacked. They spoke about India as home despite having left decades ago, and they raised me to see myself as Indian first and American second, as if my birth in Illinois was an accident of geography rather than a fundamental aspect of my identity. The message was clear: America was where we lived for economic opportunity, but India was where we truly belonged. The family pressure to maintain Indian identity was intense throughout my upbringing as my parents insisted I speak Gujarati at home, attend temple regularly, learn classical Indian dance, participate in cultural events with the local Gujarati community, and avoid dating or behaviors that seemed too American. They lived in constant fear that I would become completely Americanized and lose connection to my Indian heritage, not understanding that I had never actually had an authentic Indian identity to lose because I had grown up in America consuming American media, being educated in American schools, and forming my worldview through American rather than Indian cultural frameworks. The college identity exploration began at Northwestern, where I finally had space to question the either/, or framing I had grown up with and started exploring what it meant to be both Indian and American, or neither, or something entirely new. I connected with other South Asian American students who shared similar experiences of cultural straddling, and for the first time I felt like I had found people who understood the specific psychological complexity of being raised between two cultures without fully belonging to either. The India trip planning started during my senior year at Northwestern when my parents announced we would finally be visiting India as a family. My first trip to the country they had always described as my homeland, despite it being completely foreign to me. They were excited to introduce me to extended family, show me the village where they grew up, and help me connect with my roots. assuming that physical presence in India would activate some dormant sense of Indian identity that had been suppressed by growing up in America. The arrival devastation began within hours of landing in Mumbai when I realized that I stood out as obviously foreign despite my Indian appearance. The way I dressed, walked, spoke, and carried myself marked me as American to Indians who could immediately identify my outsider status. At the airport, a customs officer asked in Hindi where I was coming from, and when I responded in my American accented Hindi, he switched to English and treated me like a tourist rather than a returning member of the diaspora. The village reception in Gujarat was my first extended interaction with relatives who had only known me through photos and occasional video calls, and their reaction to meeting me in person was a mixture of curiosity, judgment, and disappointment. My cousins around my age looked at my jeans and t-shirt with barely concealed disdain, whispered to each other in rapid Gujarati I couldn't fully follow, and made no effort to include me in their conversations or activities despite my parents' insistence that we were family. The ABCD mockery started on my second day in the village when my cousin Priya asked me a question in Gujarati that I didn't understand, and when I asked her to repeat it more slowly or switch to English, she laughed and said, "Oh right, you're ABCD, American Born Confused Desi. You don't really speak Gujarati, do you?" The acronym was delivered with such contempt that I felt physically struck by the rejection it represented. I wasn't Indian enough for Indians, and the confusion, she mocked, wasn't my fault, but the inevitable result of being raised in America by parents who had tried to maintain Indian culture in an American context. The language humiliation was constant throughout the visit as relatives criticized my Gujarati pronunciation, laughed at my grammatical mistakes, and switched to English when speaking to me in a way that positioned me as a linguistic outsider who couldn't participate in family conversations conducted in our native language. What hurt most was that my imperfect Gujarati represented my parents' best efforts to maintain linguistic connection despite raising me in an English-dominant environment, and mocking it felt like mocking their entire immigration struggle. The clothing criticism started when my aunt suggested I should wear traditional Indian clothes rather than my American jeans and tops, implying that my Western clothing was disrespectful or inappropriate for our family gathering. When I explained that I didn't own much Indian clothing and wasn't comfortable in traditional outfits I had no experience wearing, she looked disappointed and made a comment about how I had forgotten my culture. The message was clear. Authentic Indian identity required performing specific cultural markers I had never learned because I had grown up in America. The behavioral judgment extended to everything about me: the way I spoke, the questions I asked, my interest in exploring tourist sites rather than just spending time with family, my vegetarianism that was based on animal welfare rather than religious principles, and my independence and assertiveness that seemed inappropriate for an Indian woman in their traditional village context. Every aspect of my American upbringing marked me as foreign and other despite sharing blood, name, and physical appearance with my relatives. The cousin rejection was particularly painful because I had hoped to connect with relatives my own age and develop relationships that would help me feel connected to my Indian heritage. Instead, my cousins made clear through their exclusion, mockery, and barely concealed contempt that they saw me as a fake Indian, too Americanized to be one of them, too privileged and spoiled to understand their lives, and too foreign to deserve inclusion in their social circle despite our family connection. The cultural knowledge gaps became sources of shame as I realized how little I actually knew about Indian history, politics, current events, social norms, religious practices, and cultural references that my relatives assumed all Indians should know. My education had been American, my media consumption was American, my entire frame of reference was American, but I was being judged by standards of Indian cultural literacy I had never had opportunity to develop because I had grown up 8,000 miles away in a completely different cultural context. The food rejection happened when I couldn't eat certain traditional dishes that my relatives prepared, not because I didn't want to but because my American-raised palate found some flavors and textures unfamiliar and difficult. My relatives interpreted my food selectivity as rejection of their culture and hospitality, rather than understanding that taste preferences are formed through childhood exposure, and I had grown up eating Americanized versions of Indian food rather than authentic regional cuisine. The breaking point came during a family gathering when my uncle asked me to explain what India means to me, and I gave an honest answer about how India represented my heritage and my parents' homeland but wasn't really my home because I had grown up in America and felt more American than Indian despite my appearance and family connections. The room went silent, and I could see the offense and disappointment on relatives' faces at my admission that I didn't feel deeply connected to the country they had expected me to embrace as my true homeland. The return to America was supposed to bring relief, but instead brought a different kind of identity crisis, as I realized that my India trip hadn't resolved my cultural confusion, but had actually deepened it. Now I not only felt not quite American in America, but I also knew definitively that I wasn't Indian in India either. I was caught in a cultural no man's land, rejected as too American by Indians and too Indian to be fully accepted as American, belonging nowhere completely. The depression that followed my India trip was profound as I grieved the loss of the comforting fiction that India was my homeland, where I would finally fit in and feel authentic belonging. My parents' stories about India had created expectations that reality had shattered, and I was left feeling more lost and confused about my identity than ever before. The cultural straddling that had felt like richness in college now felt like deficit, as if being between two cultures meant belonging to neither. The relationship strain with my parents intensified because they couldn't understand why I had come back from India feeling disconnected rather than reconnected to my heritage. They had built their entire parenting approach around maintaining Indian culture and preventing me from becoming too American, and my honest admission that I felt more American than Indian despite their efforts felt like rejection of their values and invalidation of their immigration sacrifices. The therapy that began during my identity crisis was with Dr. Meera Sharma, an Indian-American psychologist who specialized in treating first-generation Americans dealing with bicultural identity issues and belonging struggles. She introduced me to the concept of third culture kids, people who grow up between cultures and develop hybrid identities that don't fit neatly into either of their heritage cultures, and who often struggle with belonging and authenticity questions throughout their lives. Third culture identity isn't about being confused or lacking authentic cultural connection. It's about having a legitimate identity that's different from both your parents' culture and your birth country's dominant culture, Dr. Sharma explained during one of our sessions. You're not a failed Indian or a failed American. You're successfully navigating a third space that combines elements of both cultures in ways that create something new and valid, even if neither India nor America fully recognizes or validates that hybrid identity. She helped me understand that my experience of rejection in India wasn't unique, but was actually common among diaspora children who visit their parents' homelands and discover they're seen as foreign despite ethnic and family connections. The fantasy of returning home, to a place you've never actually lived, is a diaspora phenomenon that often ends in disappointment when the imagined homeland doesn't match reality and when relatives in the homeland see you as outsider rather than family. The reframing work involved learning to see my hybrid identity as valuable rather than deficient, as richness rather than confusion, and as authentic existence rather than failed performance of either Indian or American identity. Dr. Sharma helped me understand that third culture identity is legitimate even though it doesn't fit either of the binary categories that society wants to force people into, and that creating my own sense of belonging rather than waiting for external validation was actually a necessary developmental task for people in my situation. The community finding happened when I connected with other first-generation South Asian Americans through organizations like South Asian Americans Leading Together, SALT, and online communities where people shared experiences of cultural straddling, homeland rejection, and permanent outsider status. The collective experiences validated that my identity crisis wasn't individual pathology, but reflected systematic patterns affecting millions of diaspora children who grow up between cultures without fully belonging to either. The writing project that emerged from my healing included essays and blog posts about third culture identity, the mythology of homeland, and the grief of discovering you don't belong in either of the countries that claim and reject you simultaneously. The writing connected me with readers worldwide who resonated with experiences of cultural in-betweenness and helped me realize I wasn't alone in navigating the psychological complexity of hybrid identity. The family reconciliation involved difficult conversations with my parents about their expectations for my cultural identity and my reality as someone who grew up in America consuming American culture despite their best efforts to raise me Indian. I helped them understand that I wasn't rejecting Indian culture or their values, but was honestly acknowledging that my American upbringing had fundamentally shaped who I was in ways that couldn't be erased by trips to India or participation in cultural events. The India reframing required letting go of the fantasy that India was my homeland where I truly belonged and accepting that it was my parents' homeland that I could visit and learn from but would never be mine in the way it was theirs. The loss of that comforting fiction was painful, but also liberating because it freed me from trying to be someone I wasn't and allowed me to build identity based on my actual experience rather than idealized notions about where I should belong. The American acceptance required recognizing that despite external positioning as perpetual foreigner, I was fundamentally American in my values, worldview, communication style, and cultural literacy. My Indian heritage was an important part of my identity, but it was mediated through American experience in ways that made me American first, even if America didn't always recognize me as such. The third culture embrace involved creating identity that wasn't about choosing between Indian and American, but about recognizing that I was something else. A third culture person with hybrid identity that combined elements of both cultures in unique ways. This identity had no traditional homeland, no single culture to claim, and no clear belonging, but it was mine, and it was valid even without external validation from either India or America. The advocacy work that developed includes speaking and writing about third culture identity, the mythology of return, and the need for more nuanced understanding of diaspora children's experiences. I work to help parents understand that their children won't have the same relationship to their homeland that they do, and to help institutions recognize and validate hybrid identities rather than forcing people into binary categories. The mentorship relationships I've developed focus on supporting younger South Asian Americans who are grappling with cultural identity questions and need validation that their hybrid identity is legitimate even if it doesn't match their parents' expectations or their relatives' definitions of authentic Indian identity. I help them understand that belonging is something we can create rather than something we wait to receive from cultures that may never fully accept us. Today, I work as a cultural consultant helping organizations understand bicultural and third culture identity dynamics while also writing about diaspora experiences and belonging questions. The work allows me to use my personal experience professionally while also creating visibility for identity complexities that mainstream narratives often oversimplify or ignore. The return to India 2 years ago was completely different from my first trip because I went with realistic expectations about being seen as foreign, with no illusions about discovering homeland belonging, and with acceptance of my outsider status rather than desperately trying to prove I belonged. The trip was more enjoyable and less psychologically devastating because I had stopped trying to be someone I wasn't and had accepted my third culture identity as legitimate even if relatives didn't recognize it as authentic Indian identity. Key resources and solutions that made the difference. Professional therapy with culturally competent providers who understand third culture identity and bicultural development helps process the grief and confusion of belonging nowhere completely. Organizations like South Asian Americans Leading Together, SALT, and other diaspora advocacy groups provide community and resources for people navigating hybrid cultural identities. Third culture kid resources and literature help contextualize experiences of cultural in-betweenness and validate hybrid identity as legitimate rather than confused or failed performance of heritage culture. Online communities and support groups connect diaspora children dealing with similar belonging struggles and provide validation that their experiences are common rather than unique. Family education and counseling helps immigrant parents understand their children's cultural identity development and adjust expectations about heritage culture transmission. Writing and creative expression provide outlets for processing complex identity questions and connecting with others who share similar experiences. Cultural identity exploration opportunities, including homeland visits with realistic expectations, help diaspora children understand their heritage without illusions about belonging. Academic research on diaspora identity, third culture kids, and transnational belonging provides frameworks for understanding complex identity dynamics. Today, when I meet other first-generation Americans who are planning their first trip to their parents' homeland expecting to finally feel like they belong somewhere, I gently prepare them for possible disappointment and help them understand that homeland belonging is often a fantasy that doesn't match reality when you actually visit. I encourage them to approach the experience with curiosity rather than expectation, to recognize they'll be seen as foreign regardless of ethnic appearance, and to understand that their hybrid identity is valuable even if it's not validated by either of their heritage cultures. Belonging nowhere completely is painful, but creating third culture identity that honors both heritages while acknowledging they've been fundamentally shaped by growing up between cultures is authentic existence rather than failed performance of someone else's expectations.